Thanks for joining us in this webinar on Java 12 today. So before I start, I'll address the main question. Why should you attend this session and why you need to know what's new in Java 12? So if you can identify yourself in one of these situations, I think you are a good fit for the session. So the first one is this. The session title came as a surprise to you, and maybe you thought, really? Java 12 is already out? And here's the second one. You know Java 12 is out and you are curious to find out what's in it. Another situation may be, since you program in Java, everyone around you expects you to know what's new in Java 12. But since you are programming in an older version of Java, you didn't really get the time to explore the latest version. And here's one more. Perhaps people come to you and seek your advice on whether they should move to Java 12 or not. So if you think you could see yourself in one of these situations or perhaps a similar one, you are in the right place. So, okay, so this was about typing yes in the chat window if you think you could see yourself in any of the previous situations or a similar one. Just so you know that yes, you are attending the right session. Okay, so here's the agenda for today's session. So we are saying hello to Java 12. So I'll cover the impact of the release cadence on the adoption of Java 12. I'll take you through the links where you can access the list of the changes in Java 12. Since it's a JetBrains webinar, I will not cover each and every change which is there in Java 12. I'll limit it to some of the changes. In Java 12 includes multiple small changes, and I've included a list deliberately because these links will help you find how you can perhaps discover the exhaustive list of changes in Java 12. I'll take you through the language changes in Java 12, which is the new switch expressions. I'll also cover how to move around the API changes. Again, that's a list and not really each and every API which has changed in Java 12. Quickly, I'll take you through the GC changes. We have a new GC and two major modifications to the existing G1 GC, which is the garbage first collector. We'll also talk about whether you should be moving to Java 12. And at the end, as Trisha said, we'll conclude with questions and answers. So Oracle introduced the 6 months release cadence with Java 9. So essentially all versions after Java 9 are released every 6 months. And with the 6 months release cadence, a Java version is either a long-term support release or a short-term support release. So I ran a poll yesterday requesting developers to share their experience with Java 12. A very high percentage, which is 38% of people, were really not aware that Java 12 is out. And yes, for your information, it was released on March 19th this year. Another high percentage of people wanted to know what's new in it. And as we would expect, very few are planning to move to Java 12 and also doubtful whether they should do so. The least votes are where developers are curious to know whether Java 12 works with other frameworks or tools. Also, the newer versions are not released with a lot of hype now, the way they were released earlier when Oracle had the regular 3 years release cadence. So which explains why people don't know when a newer version is released. So here's another poll which reflects, number one, on the previous poll, why people are not aware about the new releases of Java. And number 2, on Java's release cadence, how it is affecting the adoption of newer versions. Because there are numerous polls to suggest that majority of production code is still on Java 8, and we all agree with that. But however, that doesn't stop the developers from trying out the newer versions. Java 9 was released in 2017, 3 years after Java 8. And its adoption rate was slow because we had the module system, which was kind of a showstopper in when we are talking about adoption of Java 9. Also, it was a short-term support release. Java 11, which was released last year, September, is a long-term support release, and organizations prefer to migrate from one LTS version to another LTS version. So the last version before Java 11 was Java 8. So people are moving to Java 11 rather than moving to Java 12. So with the new release cadence of Java, the rate of innovation is same because we are talking about releasing of the features that could be used by developers. So Oracle is working on in the same pace. What has changed is the rate of delivery. Now, every 6 months, the developers get to work with the newer features that come in Java. Of course, we also talk about the predictable dates. Now, we don't have to wait for a feature, a star feature to complete to get a newer version of Java. We know that every 6 months, we will get a new version, whether or not a feature is able to make it to a particular Java version or not. So the features are not given that much of importance as they were earlier given. And of course, the new features are not punished for being in time. So has anyone of you been at an event where if the chief guest doesn't arrive in time, all the rest of the people who are actually been there in time are punished for being in time? So that's how the Java release cadence is working now. The features which are ready, they are released with the next Java version. And the ones which are not, the Java versions are not delayed for those features. So we get to the next one on today's session, on the agenda, which is how to access what's new in Java 12. So if you go to the link which is mentioned here, I could just open this one and we would see the list of the JEPs which are included in Java 12. As you can see, we have the features list here, and so we could access what's new in Java 12 using multiple ways. I could access the JEPs, which is the JDK enhancement proposals, which are the features that went in Java 12, and I could also access the complete list of API changes which are included in Java 12. So this link is usually not accessible by a lot of developers because a lot of developers don't know about this list. So this one would give you the API differences between Java SE 11 and Java SE 12. So as you can see, the changes are in red font, the additions are highlighted with a green background, and the removals are with a pink background. So let's click this link here and we could actually access what's happening in the Java API. So let's scroll to our favorite java.lang, and you can see let's go to class string. Here's the class string, and we can see there's one modification, 4 additions, and in total there are 5 changes. So let's click on Java string. So the additions, as we saw earlier in the previous window, the additions are highlighted with a green background. And in the left pane, you could also scroll down again to find out what the additions are. So describe constable is one of the methods which is new to Java, which is new to class string in Java 12. You have in method indent and others as well. So this link would give you a list of all the additions, modifications, deletions to Java SE 12. Okay, now let's go to the new language features in Java 12. So essentially we have only one, which is the switch expressions. So I'll move to the demo now. So okay, so with switch expressions, we have an option of using the switch statements as switch expressions. And as we know, switch expressions is something, an expression is something which would return a value back to you. And with Java 12, we could use a switch statement as both as an expression and as a statement. So let's start with some code here. Let me define an enum, which is single-use plastic. And I create a couple of constants here. And the constants are spoon, I have straw, I have bottle, and a cup. And let me create a method which returns a value of type int. I say damage. So this is kind of trying to calculate the damage that you are doing to your planet by using single-use plastic items. Okay, so I pass in a value of method parameter of type single-use plastic to this method, and okay, so I have a local variable here which I return from this method, and let me switch on the method parameter, and I say if the case is spoon, the damage which is done to the environment is, let's say, 10 points. I have a break statement so that the control doesn't fall through the case labels. The second case label is straw. I say the damage in this case is 11 points. Again, I use the break statement. For the next case label, which is bottle, let me say that the damage is 20 points. So folks, if you are using single-use plastic bottles, then the damage is, I think, the most. Okay, so we have another break statement. And the last case label, which is the cup. And now the damage is, again, 11 points. Okay, so let me reformat all the code using a shortcut, which is Control-Alt-L. So as you can see, the code looks much better with the formatting now. Okay, so what can we do? Okay, so before I move further, I would like to state the project settings that you must have in your IntelliJ IDEA so that you can use the JDK 12 features. So we can use Control-Alt-Shift-S to open the project structure. And I already have my project settings as 12. But if you have it for a previous version, then you'll have to change it to 12. And also excuse me, the project language level to 12. So as you can see, there are multiple options which are available. So I could have my project SDK at a particular number, let's say 12, but if the language level that I use for my IntelliJ IDEA project is, let's say, 10, I could actually compile my project to a previous version. So I would have it as 12 because I want to use the switch expressions in Java 12. And of course, if you don't have this, you could go to Project SDK, create, add a new SDK. And since I already have JDK 12 on my system, so this I could use it. But if you don't already have JDK 12 on your system, then probably you would need to download and install it first, and then go to the project structure settings and add it to your IntelliJ IDEA settings so that you can use it before you move forward. Okay, so I click on OK. So the settings are good, and I click on OK. So as you can see, this switch statement, which is the traditional switch statement, is a kind of a multiple if-else statement. I am switching on the method parameter, and depending on the case, I'm assigning a value to a variable. So let's say how I could convert that the switch statement to a switch expression. So if I press Alt Enter on the switch keyword, I could use the option of replacing with switch expression. Now, isn't that so concise? Because let me go back to the code that I had earlier. Wow. So I'm letting go so many lines of code. Again, I would press Alt Enter and replace with use the option of replacing with switch expression. And this is what I get. Again, I can see that 11 is underlined. So let me see what IntelliJ IDEA suggests here. So it says I could merge the case cup with case straw because it is returning the same value. So let me do that. Now let's compare this with the switch statement that we have earlier. With the earlier switch statements, it's not possible to use multiple case labels in the same switch branch. And with the previous statement, I would have to use this on in separate branches. But now with the switch expressions, I could use it in the same branch. Of course, the syntax is concise. You define what you have to return on the right side of the array key of the arrow. Now let's see if I could inline the variable. So as you can notice, at present this code block is just assigning a value to the switch expression, is assigning a value to the variable damage and just returning it. So what we could do by inlining the variable is we could do away with the local variable damage and just use the switch expression to return the value. Wow, this works like a charm now. Okay, so we talked about making the switch statements concise. We talked about using multiple constants, multiple case labels in a single branch. We talked about inlining the variable. So let's talk about the default fall through. So let's go back to the original code. I just use Control Z to go back to this one. So what happens if I just remove the break statement here? In this case, if I pass the value straw to this method, the control will fall through case label straw to bottle, and a value of 20 would be assigned to bottle, but not if you use switch expressions. So that's another advantage of using switch expressions. And we also talk about the exhaustive cases. Okay, let's again replace that with switch expression, and I inline this variable. Now, what happens if I delete this value? So IntelliJ IDEA tells me that switch expression does not cover all the possible input values, because we are talking about an enum here. We have 4 constants for the enum which could be passed to this method. And if I'm not covering one of the constants, I have 2 options here. So let me see what are the options. I could either create a missing branch, switch branch, which is bottle, or I could insert a default branch. So let me insert a default branch here. Okay, so that's the default code. Of course, I could change it to what I want. So what happens? Okay, so let me try out the other option. And now I choose creating a missing switch branch, which is bottle. Again, I could define the value that I want. Now this is an enum where we know what are the possible values that could be passed to the variable. But what happens if we talk about the cases or the types where we don't have an exhaustive list of values, let's say an integer? Okay, so let me merge this with, and let me define another method. I say static int damage again, and in this case, let's say I pass the value as a string, and I switch on the method parameter, and I say if the case is spoon, the damage is, let me define the variable again. I missed defining it earlier, so I define the variable as the local variable as damage, and I return this variable here. I assign a value 10 to it, and I break out of the switch statement. So the other value could be straw, and I say the damage is 11 now. Again, I say break out of the switch statement. In this case, okay, so let me insert a switch statement, and okay, I am inlining the variable again. And now in this case, if you see, IntelliJ IDEA has inserted this line of code. It says if I don't pass either of these values, 0 would be returned. But if I delete that particular line, now it says the switch expression does not cover all possible input values. So when you are returning a value using switch expressions, you must ensure that the values that you are covering in the switch case labels are exhaustive. With the enums, you can define all the constants, but for other values like string, integer, byte, short, or the other values which a switch expression accepts, since the exhaustive list of values would not be possible for you to type in, you would need a default case label. So let me insert the default branch here. Of course, I could modify as required. And okay. And let's talk about another format. Okay, so one of the ways of returning values from switch expressions is to just type in the value that we want to return. But what if I want to define, let's say, a local variable? I say number is 100, and then I want to do something with this number. I have some, let's say, some code that manipulates this value. I could also connect to a database or whatever. And then I want to return a value. So in this case, I could use the break statement and I could return a value. So this is how I could use a block of code within a switch branch. I could define a local variable and I could use the break statement to the break keyword to return a value. I can also, yes, so let me delete this one and see what I could have. So as you can see, by default, I could also throw an exception from a case label. So we're talking about, so we just talked about using local variables in switch branches. We talked about using break statement to return values, and this is where we are using a block of statement. Otherwise, we could just use the arrow key to return a value. Okay, so we have covered pretty much with respect to the switch statements. So yes, I have a question for you. Okay. Okay, so this is a quick image to kind of which highlights what is being changed when I go from switch statement to switch expressions. As you can see, the colon, which was used in switch statements, is replaced by an arrow now. And instead of using the assignment of a variable, you could just use a value to return. We also talk about the comma separated multiple case labels here. And okay, so again, I already used the break statement to return a value. So, okay, so this one uses another format. So this is an example I guess I missed in my demo. So if you take a note, it uses a colon to start the code and uses break to return a value. In all the previous examples that I showed in my demo, it uses an arrow to specify the value that you want to return, but you can also use a colon followed by the break statement and the value that you want to return. Okay, so we've covered the exhaustive cases. So as I mentioned, you would get a compilation error if you try to use switch expressions without covering the exhaustive cases and trying to return a value from it. Okay, so yes, so this one's for you to answer, for the attendees to answer. So you would have to tell me which line of code would you enter to make the code compile? Is it only one or is it line number 2? Okay, so let me explain. So imagine that you have a class planet and we are talking about a static variable, which is private static long damage. And then I have a method which is use. And I I am switching on the plastic method parameter which is passed to it, which doesn't cover all the cases of this enum, and the remaining case is plate. So we have only one which is remaining. So what would be the right answer? If you add line number 1, will that help this code to compile? Or if you add line number 2, will it enable the code to compile? Or should you add both of them? Okay, just a few minutes for you to answer the question, and then I'll move forward to the next slide. So perhaps on the count of 5, I'll move to the next slide. Tick, tick 1, tick, tick 2, tick, tick 3, tick, tick 4, and tick, tick 5. And I'll discuss the question at the end of the session. Yes. Yes, the other interesting part about the switch expressions is that it's a preview language feature. And what that essentially means, so this is a new concept in Java which was introduced in 2018. And what this essentially means is that it's a new language feature or a virtual machine feature, and it's fully specified, it's fully implemented, yet it's not permanent. So by having a feature as a preview language feature, Oracle gives that feature to try out to the developers, and if they have any major problems with the feature, then perhaps the feature could be dropped altogether, or if the problem could be rectified, then the feature would be added to the platform with modifications. And why do you think that's important? Because Java is almost 20 years old now, and it's not easy to introduce a new feature, whether it's a language feature or a platform feature, if it breaks the existing code, because we are talking about the backward compatibility. So any new feature which is added to the language, the platform, should be safe to do so. And of course, we are talking about high quality features. So the experiment or the preview features are not incomplete feature, and they are not experimental. They are completely implemented features. It's just that Oracle is seeking the feedback from developers so that it knows, yes, it's doing the right thing before it is included in the language. Okay, so here's a tweet from Brian, who is the chief architect at Oracle. So I deliberately included that in my session just to re-emphasize the fact that yes, Oracle is not tagging Java expressions as a preview language feature. It is actually seeking feedback from the developers. So as you can see, apart from, of course, the official channels, Brian is looking for the developer feedback on the latest Java feature, which is switch expressions, and before it exits the preview status. So I asked Brian, because I looked around for the last date to submit the feedback. Of course, there was no specific date to submit the feedback. But yes, if you are thinking of submitting your feedback now, they are not accepting it. It's done. The train has it has left the station, the platform. Okay, so here's another link that you can use. So this is the this page shows the changes to the Java language specification, and as you can see, it was modified just a day back on 20th of May 2019, and this is the link which you can use to access this page. And it actually Okay, I don't have the link here, so this is just an image, and so sorry, I won't be able to show that in action to you. But if you could access this link yourself, just type in the address that you see here in the address bar, and you would be able to see how documentation on the usage of switch statements, switch expressions is added to the Java language specification. And I repeat, it was not added yet. So it's only now that it has been added. And here 14.15.2, you can also see the break with statement. So of course, after collecting the feedback from the developers on switch expressions, Oracle also included another hyphenated keyword to Java language, which is break with. So in one of the examples, let me go back to the example. Okay, so in this case, I used the break statement to return a value. But of course, I guess this was sounding a bit confusing to the developers because we were not used to using a break statement to return a value. So Oracle has introduced a new keyword, which is break with. So as you can see here, the break with statement, and moving forward, you would be, so with Java 12, you can use break statement to return a value, but moving forward, you would be able to use break with statement to return a value from switch expressions. And Oracle is planning to include a lot of others hyphenated keywords so that introduction of new keywords doesn't break a lot of previous code. Okay, so that's a quick question for you. When var was introduced in Java 10, so you have to be honest here. So how many of you defined your variable using the name var? Right? Yes. So that's the problem when new keywords are introduced in the language. So using the hyphenated keywords would kind of have a lot more, Oracle would have a lot more variable names to add to the language without breaking this existing code. Okay, so now let's go to the API changes. Okay, now again, I would refer back to the list of the API changes which I showed earlier. So again, you could click on this one and you can actually, as I showed earlier, you can access all the changes which are included in Java 12. And I did not include any specific examples on purpose for this because it's easy to just kind of sit back and watch through the example codes. And I would really like you to, first of all, find out what are the modifications or the additions or even the removals in Java 12. And oh no, please excuse this window. Sorry. And then try out the new language additions yourself. Okay, so let's go back to, okay, so Java 12 has also added a new API, which is a new package, Java lang.constant. And all of these classes now include a resolve constant description method, DESC for short. And again, I have not included code deliberately on purpose for this one. JDK 12 also supports a lot of new characters. We are talking about chess symbols here. We're talking about Mayan numerals, which is an interesting base 20 numerical system, and a lot of other languages as well. Okay, so now we are talking about the JVM changes. So I'll quickly talk about the new experimental garbage collector, which is the Shenandoah. This garbage collector is proposed and developed by engineers at Red Hat. It promises significantly low pauses. It's a region-based garbage collector which collects garbage in parallel and concurrent manner. It is interesting to note that the pause times are independent of application's live data, which is unlike the previous garbage collectors Java had. And with the hardware engineering and lower cost, servers have more memory and processing power than ever before. And modern applications are increasingly demanding lower pause times. With service level agreement applications that guarantee response times of 10 to 500 milliseconds. So to meet the lower end of the range, Shenandoah GC is able to meet that lower end, and it uses algorithms that enables programs to execute with the given memory. The other point is that it can keep the pause times low as below 10 milliseconds. If you talk about the other garbage collectors, that's not attainable with, let's say, a Java application that use 200 GB of memory. And it isn't possible with the compacting algorithms, which would exceed the limit of 10 milliseconds. Because even for compacting 10% of this memory, that would exceed the timings. Shenandoah uses an algorithm that compacts the memory concurrently while the Java threads are running. And in this case, objects are moved during concurrent GC cycle and all its references immediately access the newer copy. The other modifications in GC space is abortable mixed collections for garbage first GC, G1 GC as we call it. So what happens when the garbage first GC tries to collect the garbage from the young regions? So the young regions are the ones which are where the objects are frequently used and discarded. And we have the old regions where we have objects which have lived quite a long time, much longer than the young collections. So what happens when the G1 GC runs out of memory? It first tries to free the young spaces, and then if it cannot keep up with the allocation by cleaning up the young collection, then it goes for cleaning up a mixed collection which includes the old and the new generation. But in that case, what happens if I want to abort the collection? Before JDK 12, that was not possible, but with JDK 12, it is possible for me to abort a mixed collection for the G1 garbage collector. Of course, when I say I can abort a collection, I am cutting down on the time. So what happens, a lot of applications are now running in container spaces. So what happens if you have multiple applications or you have multiple JVMs and they are using the memory the one which has been assigned to them, but they are not using it? In that case, the organization running those applications would have to pay more for running the applications, because we are talking about paying for the resources. Again, if an application is using resources which are not being used, such as memory, then it's something that needs to be corrected. So with Java 12, the G1 garbage collector can promptly return the unused committed memory from unused committed memory, because there are only two times when the garbage collector returns the memory. So the one is the full GC, which is the full garbage collection, and that only happens, that really happens. So G1 would do all that it can to avoid a full garbage collection. It would try to free up the young spaces, and only if it doesn't manage to allocate more objects, then it would go for a full garbage collection. And that's one time when a garbage collector would return the unused committed memory to the host. But with JDK 12, you could tune it to return the uncommitted memory at particular times or events. Okay, so that's the last slide, and I would like to leave you with one of the tweets which I received for one of the polls that I mentioned initially. So it says, the upgrade to Java 9 seemed like a huge step until it was clear that if I didn't really need Jigsaw, I could pretty much ignore it. From Java 9 to 12 isn't a big deal as moving from 7 to 8. So what that essentially means that we could be thinking about steps A, B, C to migrate to a certain level, but we could also realize that we might not need those steps to move to a newer versions. So as Java developers, architects, managers, we need to know what are the options which exist for when we are updating our technology wardrobes, because to make good decisions, we must be aware about the choices that we have. And it's only from a good pool of choice that we can make a good decision. So my advice, if you are thinking about moving to Java 12, I would suggest that even if you are, so Java 12 is a short-term support release, and since we had Java 11, which was a long-term support release just 6 months back, I would advise you to move to Java 11. But as developers, I would like you to use platforms like IntelliJ IDEA, where you could compile your code and run it against multiple versions and see where the problem lies. If you, let's say, if you're moving your code to Java 11, and if you plan to move it to a later version sometime later, it's good to test your existing code against the newer versions, because from Java 9, Oracle has started taking off the deprecated API more seriously, and they are not just letting you go with the compilation errors, they are removing the APIs. So it's a small migration, I would say, to be on Java 11, but test your code on Java 12 so that you know there are no major showstoppers or roadblocks, so that when you move to a newer version, you get to see a lot of problems. Thank you so much, and I'm good to take the questions now.
Thanks so much, Mela. That was great. We have had a bunch of questions. I answered a few of them on the back end from what I understood, particularly around switch expressions. There was one question which I was kind of interested to know what the answer was. The question was, can we join the default section with another case section if the return values are the same? Or does default always have to be separate?
Yes, I guess it always has to be separate. We can't have that. I would really have to check that myself.
Yeah. Oh, because it's not case. It doesn't start with case, right?
Right. So it only has default. So I don't think that's possible.
I agree. I think you could try it, but I think you're going to get some sort of compiler error. Right.
Right.
Yeah, so if your default there, well, actually, so try that. Try turning the default there to 11 and see what IntelliJ IDEA suggests. Because I think it would want you to delete straw and cup because that's dealt with by the default. There you go. See?
Okay, so it says delete redundant switch branch. Okay, so it has, okay, so you cannot actually have the default case with the other cases. So in this case, IntelliJ IDEA stated that, okay, so because you are using the same return value for the default branch and for the other labels, so those labels were redundant and it just removed those.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so let me see also. There was, so at your slide where you asked the question about which code would fix the problem.
Right.
We had a
we'll
number,
go back.
as you'd expect, we had a number of different answers to that.
Okay.
Where was it? So,
yes.
Right, so there was a possibility of either adding another enum value or adding the default value. So we had some people saying we need the default, some people saying both, some people saying either. Yeah, some people saying either.
All right, so the correct answer is either, because we are talking about switch expressions which are returning a value, and because as I mentioned, the plate is the only enum value, enum constant, which is missing from the case labels. So either you could add line number 1 or line number 2. Of course, if you would add both of them, it would be correct as well. But the answer was which one of them should you add. So yes, I think the answer would be 1 or 2 or both. So in this case, all 3. Right.
Okay, that's great. There was also some confusion around the break and break with. So as far as I understand it, because people were sort of saying, how can you use break to return values and break to jump to labels? How does it work with the backwards compatibility? So I believe what you're saying is that what they will do from Java 13 onwards, you won't use break, you'll use break with. Is that right?
Right. So as I mentioned, so that's a preview language feature, and Oracle was trying to collect the feedback, and a lot of developers suggested the same thing. So there was a lot of confusion when to use break without a value and when to use break with a value. So they have modified the switch expressions. So instead of using the break statement with a value to return a value, they would be now using break with, which is break hyphen with. But that would apply from the next version, or yes, the next version, but not this version. So with Java 12, you can still use break and then the value to return a value from the switch.
This is where the new release cadence gets a little bit confusing, right? Because, and the fact that we have preview features, because as you said right at the beginning, preview features are kind of malleable. They are likely to change. So we shouldn't really have been using Java 12 with preview features in production, because there's a good chance that switch expressions will change going forward.
Right. You're right, because that's as good as saying that they have a beta feature which they are giving out to the developers. And as with every beta feature that we know, yes, we have a possibility of change there. So it's good for the developers to try it out to help shape how they would like their Java to be. But of course, there is a risk factor there, because if we are using in production, then we would have to change it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's an important thing to notice. We should be using the preview features to, as you say, help shape the language, give feedback, and say what's working and what's not.
Right. Because it's easy to crib about some features. It's easy to say, oh, Java is not doing, let's say, things A, B, or C. But it's important to participate and give your feedback by just using it. So we're not, Oracle is not asking for a lot of inputs there. They're not asking for every person to go and contribute to the API or something. But by just testing it out, developers can help shape Java as they want to be.
Yeah. So there's a related question here. Is there a way to prohibit preview features in build configuration, e.g. by supplying arguments to the compiler? And the answer is actually by default, you don't get preview features, right? They're not turned on by default.
Right. Both the experimental features and the preview features, they are turned off by default. And to use them, you have to turn them on by supplying the relevant command line arguments. And of course, when we configure it in IntelliJ IDEA, that adds it to the configuration, adds it to the tools, the compilation process.
Right. I have a question here. Will Java 12 work with Spring Boot 2, Spring Boot 2 framework and with Spring 5 Plus framework?
So I don't have an answer there. So perhaps we could ping Josh on that one.
Yeah, we can answer. I was using Java 12 with a few bits and pieces. It seems to just work seamlessly. But I think, again, like you said earlier, like going from 11 to 12 is fairly painless, but going from, say, 8 to 12 might be a bit of a bigger jump. As far as I'm aware, all the common libraries appear to work with Java 12. But we can find out. And what I'll do, actually, with the questions we can't fully answer, what we'll do is we'll make a note of them, and then we can add them to a blog post at the end where when we post the recording of the webinar, we can also post answers to the questions we couldn't answer.
Right. That would be great. Yeah.
There's another question about, did you mention constable type earlier on?
Come again? Did I mention?
Constable type. I think it's something, it's in part of Project Amber, I think, but I don't remember you mentioning it. It might have been in one of the, sorry, let me find it. Sorry, I'm just trying to scroll past all the questions. Okay, on the string changes, there was some mention when you looked at the string API changes in the first section of constable type.
Okay, yes.
Oh, there we go, yeah.
Yes. So that's a new interface that we have in Java Lang package. And we also have another interface, which is constant DESE. And I would really encourage the person who was asking to go through the documentation, because what I see with a lot of developers is that they don't read through a lot of documentation and then they miss a lot of points. So yes, they can access this URL here and they could just go through it.
I will also post that URL in the blog post when we have the recording later on, because I had people asking for that URL. Okay, and there was another question around, there was confusion around what are mixed collections and what's the meaning of abortable around garbage collection. I think, again, maybe what we'll do is we'll post further information about some of the garbage collection changes, the specific changes you went through, and then if people want to find out things in more detail, they could perhaps follow those links and read that documentation.
Makes sense. Yeah.
Okay, great. I believe we've answered all of the questions which are in the webinar window. Thank you everyone for being such a fantastic, engaging audience. You are very active in the questions. As I've said, what we'll do is we will post a blog post which includes a video, which includes a link to the video when this recording is available. We will answer any unanswered questions, which also means that if you didn't get a chance to ask a question right now, please feel free to ping us over Twitter or perhaps send us an email. So on Twitter, do you have our handles on the first slide? Are our Twitter handles on there?
I don't think so. No, we don't.
Well, okay, so it's email@Gupta and Trisha_G on Twitter. So feel free to ask us questions even after the webinar, and we can answer those in the blog post. And thank you very much. You've been a fantastic audience, and thank you, Mala. What a really great presentation about what's new in JDK 12.